but it really rings true in economic prosperity and growth. And and so the whole idea of building an economy that expands the private sector while contracting the public sector is what sustains a vibrant democracy with a strong middle class. And we saw for a full decade the government do exactly the opposite intentionally. Our private sector has decreased, and we are now the lowest investment in the OECD into the future of our country. We've seen the GDP per capita, which means the GDP for the middle class, collapse at the same time as we've seen a massive increase in employment in the public sector. So that's only leading one way. That's leading to 50% of the population being employed by government, all three orders of government, and the private sector being collapsed. And the old something to the effect, Margaret Thatcher, socialism works great until you run out of other people's money to spend. Well, the other people are the people that are building the money through the private sector.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Dialogue Over Division, and we get to continue our wonderful discussion with former Colonel Lieutenant David Redman on the 6 national interests that he's identified to help, make a strong, prosperous, free nation, which is something I think Canada is struggling with right now, along with its identity a little bit, but just purpose. This is something we were talking about just before recording. And today's focus is going to be on the 5th national interest, which is economic prosperity and growth. And obviously, all of these are important, but without economic prosperity and growth, you're stagnant. And then I'm looking forward to hearing all of the other side effects that come to play because, again, we were just talking about this earlier, as Canada was quite prosperous and free. And I think, as we've said before, Canadians were a little bit used to that. And then now when things, we need to put some work into it, we're having a hard time figuring out what to do and why we should even be doing anything. So again, looking forward to this discussion, and maybe I'll let you do a little blurb again about the 6 national interests and why they're important in your view, and welcome back.
Thanks, Eva. So, yeah, circle back to the beginning. I wrote the paper back in 2024, and what I was trying to do was inspire Canadians to hold their politicians and all leadership, whether it's in industry or the private sector, public sector, wherever, to a higher level of account, but at the same time to try and empower Canadians with the words to use when engaging their politicians. So the entire idea of the paper is that Canada lacks vision. And we need a 25-year vision to inspire Canadians and to inspire the public in general towards a future that is bright and prosperous, where Canadians thrive, they don't just try and survive. Okay, and right now we seem to be living in a Canada where survival is the word of the day, and yet we live in still a beautiful, beautiful country with so much potential. So I wrote the paper to try and force Canadians to have the discussion with leadership at all orders of government, municipal, provincial, and federal, but across all of the private sector as well, about what should Canada be in 25 years. And then with that discussion to try and pull our country forward in as a rapid and as a positive manner as we could. So to give them the words and the 6 national interests that define any country, just running through them really quick once again: unity, national security, good governance, rights and freedoms for a democracy, economic prosperity and growth, and individual and societal well-being. And so using those 6, and then what we're doing now is pulling them apart to all the sub-bullets that make each of those 6 national interests up. That gives Canadians the words to talk to their politicians and say, what's your status on unity and how are you going to achieve it? What does unity mean to you? What are Canadian beliefs and values? You can't define them. The previous prime minister couldn't. He said he didn't even know what they were. That's not a politician that should be leading our country. So with those six national interests locked together as the must-dos to build a 25-year vision for Canada, it's to give Canadians, again, a sense of the ability to thrive, not survive, to give them a sense of purpose when they wake up in the morning, knowing what their part is in trying to come to a better future for all Canadians. So, with that kind of as a background, where we've got to now is economic prosperity and growth. But just to recap the very top, without unity and without national security, everything that comes, the other four are hollow, because the basic definition of a country is when a group of people come together who share common beliefs and values and are prepared to live in a defined geographic area whose borders they are prepared to defend. So you need unity and you need national security. And now we can get down into economic prosperity and growth, because without economic prosperity and growth, you can't sustain your national security and you can't sustain your unity, because people are just simply trying to get enough food on the table to live. Your unity falls apart because they'll do anything to feed their family. So now we're at the point where this is how you sustain for the long term, for that 25-year vision, by building economic prosperity and growth in order to have the ability to fund everything you believe in.
And I think before we get started, it's just such an important topic to highlight, because we hear people all the time saying we need this, we want this. Why don't we have, more healthcare, for example? Our roads are bad. But one thing I think Canadians often forget is any public spending is taxpayer spending. And it seems like we came to this idea that the government has this unlimited source of money that comes from somewhere, and they're able to fund all these very important social programs. So it's like there's some people demanding we need more of those social programs. Why is the government such a big, bad, terrible thing that they're not funding these social programs? And then there's another group of people that are saying, hey, we don't have the money. We need to figure out what we're doing here. And nobody seems to be having a conversation about what you just said as an introduction. Without the economic prosperity, what kind of country do you have? And so it's just something I think maybe if we could talk about the importance of having prosperity in a country, because what are the side effects?
Correct.
Possibility to have social
The
programs.
whole idea here is to try and understand the linkages between all
Right.
six national interests. And if you have failed in good governance, which we discussed a couple of sessions ago, you end up with a government that believes that it can run the economy and actually be the economy. And
Mm-hmm.
so you see this great pull apart of the private sector versus the public sector and the growth between them. And I think I said in a previous conversation, when you achieve 50.1% of the population relying on government for their daily salary instead of the private sector, you have achieved communism. And we've seen that. And so for your viewers that were born, perhaps just the discussion about communism and the fact nobody likes to talk about the word, but it's very real and it exists in our world to this day. And we see more and more people advocating for it in Canada because they have this panacea, this Plato's utopia version of what it could achieve. For those people that were born 1989 and after, they never grew up in a world where they saw what happened when the wall came down in 1989, and people were able to get in a car and walk and drive into the former Soviet Union. And all the countries that made up the former Soviet Union, most of which are now independent free countries today, the infrastructure was totally destroyed. The roads weren't paved. I went into former East Berlin in 1993, and other than the main streets, all the roads were still dirt. dirt from World War II. They had never been paved. The economies in those countries were such that people simply spent every day trying to survive. And you lined up on Thursdays for meat. You lined up on Tuesdays to get your allocation of fresh vegetables because that's all their economy could produce. One day a week meat, one day a week vegetables. People just tried to get through each day. The cars, you wanted a car? You could sign up for a Tabat, and 15 years later, if you were lucky, your name came up in the lottery. So
So
you would
just
wait
but
15 years just to get a car.
so before we go continue, because like you said, there is some people that advocate and have very a fond vision of government run um market and communism, which is the word for that. But so why isn't that good? The government, altruistic, good for its people. Doesn't that sound like the perfect utopia?
It's always easy on paper, terrible in reality. Once you realize that the aim state of, okay, I go back to my little circle. At the stop, you're totally independent and free. If you walk to the right, you're heading into a conservative world or a liberal world, and the more you walk, you get to communism and fascism. But at the bottom, it's total dictatorship. And what's in a dictatorship? The dictator has everything. The people have nothing. We're back to the Magna Carta days when people suddenly decided they need the right to own property. Because if the government runs everything and owns everything, it does it for its own intent, not for your intent. And the whole idea of a middle class is a very recent evolution in the history of the world, where the largest body of a population is in a middle class instead of the dictator and the serfs. And communism leads constantly. George Orwell wrote the book Animal Farm. So we always talk about 1984, but if you go to Animal Farm, that's the devolution where people saw the farmer as this great evil. And all the animals on the farm hated the farmer, and so they rose up against him. But slowly but surely, the pigs who took over from the farmer created a world where all animals were equal, except the pigs were slightly more equal, and then a little bit more equal. And sooner or later, all the animals realized they were back where they started. And it was the story of the communist revolution. So when you put government in charge, it's there to sustain itself. The government is self-sustaining. It wants to grow itself bigger to stop anyone challenging its authority and its rule. And so it's always this balance in a democracy trying to have just enough government while sustaining this great middle class and trying to pull people out of the poverty and slowly but surely ending up with a tiny, tiny piece in poverty and a tiny, tiny piece in leadership and all the rest of the civilization in this middle class. And we've seen it fail time and again over the years because when somebody gets power, they don't want to give up power. And so government grows. And we've certainly seen that in the last decade in our country, where we saw the leadership of our country investing more and more and more in the public sector. And we got to, there was a recent study I saw that said we're now somewhere around the range of 43% of our economy is in the public sector with a crash diminished private sector. The balance, and I'll talk about it more later, but if you could get to 30% public sector and 70% private sector to spur the economy, I go back to what you just said. Nothing is for free. Everything costs money. So when the government spends money, it's actually taking money out of the private sector earnings that went into your pocket and giving them to somebody else. It's not free. It's coming from you, the taxpayer. And so each time somebody talks about a new government initiative, it's spending your money, not their money. They don't have any. And so the idea is to minimize the government spending and to increase the wealth that's in the middle class citizen's pocket.
I just want to say it's not that they don't have any those elected officials and bureaucrats, but they don't want to use their money. They probably wouldn't be investing their own personal money the way they're investing public money. And I
Correct.
had a
In fact,
conver
what we're seeing is they're taking more public money and putting it into their own investments, their own
Yeah,
companies, their own family-owned businesses, rather than putting it back into making a more vibrant private sector.
right. Yeah. Sorry, just wanted
Yeah,
to.
no, I totally agree. So let's go to the overarching concept, and I'm going to read this so I don't screw it up.
Yeah.
Um, in my opinion, the aim of economic prosperity and growth is the ability of Canadians to earn a good living, have private property, and provide for themselves and their families. Okay? So let's just pull that apart. The ability of Canadians. So you want Canadians to have the ability to get a job. And I mean Canadians that were born and raised here or that were positive legal immigrants to our country, the ability to work. Because nothing builds self confidence and nothing builds self worth more than having a job and being able to provide for yourself and your loved ones. Okay. So the ability to work. What a huge, important concept. Not an ability to go sit somewhere and be paid to do nothing, to do something that's meaningful. Okay.
Mhm.
To earn a good living, not to survive, but to thrive. And by a good living, I mean you can work towards the things you want. As a young person at 18 years old, when I walked out of my parents' house and joined the army, I knew that my parents owned a house and maybe one day I would, but I didn't feel entitled to own a house at 18. I knew I was going to have to bust my butt for at least 20 years, probably more, to buy a house, to first raise enough money on my own to put a down payment, and then to
Mhm.
pay off a mortgage for 35 years to ultimately own my own home. We see people today who want a good living, which starts with, okay, first you give me a house, you give me a great job, and I'd rather be an influencer and work from home. I don't really want to have to go out into that messy world and actually do hard labor or actually do any labor. I just want, I should be able to start just like my parents. This is what they've got. I want that. Okay, and now we'll talk about what I'm going to do next. So to earn a good living, to build a future for yourself and have pride in that, to have private property. That's the next piece of that statement. Private property is essential, and we see the WEF, the World Economic Forum, saying things like, you will own nothing and you will be happy. That's not how a democracy works and not how a middle class thrives.
Mhm.
You need to have the right to own property. If we go back to the age of kings, you would be hung if you shot a deer on the king's land because you never could own land. You were a serf and you tilled the soil and you gave all your earnings to the king. And he, if he was nice, gave you a meager dosage back so you wouldn't starve to death, so you could work for him some more. In a democracy with a middle class, you got to be in that ability to own your private property and to have confidence in private property. The whole system of our democracy is built around owning private property and not just land, but all those things that go with it. So when you buy something, it's yours. The pride in ownership, the pride in being able to achieve the ability to have things that you have strived for and succeeded at. And so I come all the way back around to the circle in a minute to the helicopter and bulldozer parenting, but let's finish this thought. So they own to to provide for themselves and their families. A cornerstone of the Canadian democracy is the family. And we see more and more government trying to destroy the concept of family. Family is a key word in this whole economic prosperity and growth that we're talking about. So I'll read it again. The ability of Canadians to earn a good living, have private property, and to provide for themselves and their families. Pull that statement all apart and think about every word in that statement because the whole family unit at the base of this is that when you have children, you have now invested in a future. You haven't you've stopped working just for yourself. You now need to care for your children. And I had a great discussion with my grandson just this morning. He's 22 out in the work world and trying to get in a position where he can save enough to actually have a down payment to get his first home. And he's working his butt off to achieve it, 2 jobs, doing everything he can. The whole idea of that family, my grandfather lost his entire ranch in the Great Depression, not because of the economic collapse, but because there was also a 7-year drought in the West. And slowly but surely, they lost all their cattle one at a time over the 7-year drought until he ended up at the age of 65 driving spikes for the CNR Railroad. He lost his farm, he lost his ranch, he lost everything, but he had 7 children and he had to feed them. So at the age of 65, he went back to working on the railroad with a giant hammer driving spikes to build the CNR Railroad in Western Canada because he could get enough money to barely feed his 7 children. When you have a family, you're invested in the future. You can't let your children die. So the whole idea of economic prosperity is to be assured that you can raise a family, to be assured that you can care for your children in the future, and that they will have the ability to start their life in a positive manner and go forward and then have a family of their own. So that's why in the paper, that's the statement that I make, and then everything falls from it, in my opinion, on how we look to the future. And so I circle back to helicopter parenting and bulldozer parenting because for 40 years, 20 years of helicopter parenting, 20 years of bulldozer parenting, we slowly but surely eroded the ability of people to think that risk was theirs. The world I've just described, where he lost his entire life's work, is one based on risk. And as I always said to my 3 children that are out there now in their mid and late 40s working, fair only happens inside this wall because inside our family unit, everything was fair. One child wasn't treated better than another. We raised them to try and have all the tools they needed to go out in the world, but I always made sure that they knew fair lived in this box. The
Uh-huh.
minute they walked out the front door, the world wasn't fair. They had to be armed and prepared for a world that wasn't fair. Helicopter parenting and bulldozer parenting destroyed that concept. It said to children, the world will always be fair. Either somebody like me will get bad people out of your way, or the government will get bad people out of your way. The government will care for you forever. And so when we talk about economic prosperity and growth, we're not talking about a guaranteed minimum income. That's the exact opposite of economic prosperity and growth.
Well, and can you just elaborate on that? And then I have some other questions, but why is base in universal basic income the opposite?
Okay, once you say to somebody, if you do absolutely nothing, you accept no risk in your life, and you contribute nothing to society, I will give you a place to live and enough money that you won't starve and that you can live right here, right now, forever. You
Uh-huh.
never have to do anything. You're not responsible for anything. You're not accountable for anything. But what it also says is if you don't vote for me, somebody might take away your guaranteed universal basic income because there's evil people out there that think you should actually contribute to society and not just take money from someone who actually works to give you the money so you can live and do nothing. And so you create a group of people that will support the government that gave them the universal basic income, and that creates dictatorship. But it also creates a group of people who have nothing to do all day. If you've never read a book, I have 5 books I made every one of my children read before they left home, and one of them is Brave New World, which is based on an economy where everything is provided, a society where everything is provided to everybody, and all the government's job is to do is to find a new way of entertaining the masses so they won't revolt against the government. So every day, government has to invent a new game, a new lottery, a new reality TV show to keep you subdued at home, taking your basic income and not overthrowing them.
This is
It
not a
creates
fiction,
dictatorship.
though. I don't think this is a fictional book. It sounds
No,
like a
it's
actual.
what we're living right now
Yeah.
in many portions of the democracies in the Western world. We see it, and we call it by different names. It's called, guaranteed EI for life. It's called POGI in Britain. We've created enclaves. When industry failed in parts of England, when the steel industry collapsed in the late 1950s, there's sections of England that have never known anything but a guaranteed universal basic income. And that's where you see the riots. That's where you see
Yeah.
the society breaking down, is in these enclaves of people who aren't accountable for themselves and aren't accountable to contribute to society. They expect everything to be provided, but they'll do anything to guarantee the government stay in power that will keep giving them that guaranteed income and that guaranteed housing.
Um, I was just looking at your bullet points here because I'm sure we want to get through all of them. But the one thing that really struck me in this conversation so far is how many times you mentioned middle class and how little I hear that um, outside, well, in the political realm. You don't hear people identifying and talking about how this will affect the middle class. It's just like, we're going to make your life better or we're going to give you this free money. But then it doesn't talk about the impact to the middle class, where I'm guessing here a large majority of Canadians in. And just looking south of our border, I know there's a lot of it's very divided, the MAGA movement, but my view of that movement is at least it's somebody advocating for the middle class. At least that's what a lot of middle class people in the United States identify that as. And it really struck me when you use those words already so many times, and you hardly hear that.
Well, and unfortunately, we've seen people use those words to lie to Canadians. When Justin Trudeau came to power in 2015, all you heard over and over and over again is we're working to make the middle class stronger and to help
Oh,
people get into the middle class. He said it over and over and over and over again, and then did exactly the
opposite.
opposite.
Yeah.
So I listen to snake oil salesmen in our country every day, saying things and then delivering nothing. Rhetoric versus action.
Yeah.
We've got to get back to the place where when a politician actually lies and says the lie repeatedly, there's a consequence. When you
Yeah.
walk into parliament and refuse to answer questions, there has to be consequence. And we talked about that in good governance, but it really rings true in economic prosperity and growth. And so the whole idea of building an economy that expands the private sector while contracting the public sector is what sustains a vibrant democracy with a strong middle class. And we saw for a full decade the government do exactly the opposite intentionally. Our private sector has decreased, and we are now the lowest investment in the OECD into the future of our country. We've seen the GDP per capita, which means the GDP for the middle class, collapse at the same time as we've seen a massive increase in employment in the public sector. So that's only leading one way. That's leading to 50% of the population being employed by government, all three orders of government, and the private sector being collapsed. And the old something to the effect, Margaret Thatcher, socialism works great until you run out of other people's money to spend. Well, the other people are the people that are building the money through the private sector.
Yeah.
And so we need to get back to that concept of
Yeah.
of of people contributing to a vision for our country, pulling the private sector more and more and more to a country that's thriving, and thriving doing what, right?
Yeah. No, great. Thanks for that highlight. So I'm going to turn us to the bullet points so we get through them.
Okay, so this the next concept is a national self-sufficiency for the essentials of life. So you want economic prosperity and growth, and we'll get to the growth at the end, but the economic prosperity, but it's got to include some very basic concepts that for a society to live without fear of collapse, we need self-sufficiency for the essentials of life. So water supply, food supply, housing, those basic elements. And we need to invest in the private sector to ensure that we have all of those pieces. And one of the words I constantly use when I was made head of counterterrorism, I worked across all the sectors that made up the economy of Alberta, and we defined that which was vital, necessary, significant, and then all the rest. Less than 5% made it into the vital, necessary, and significant. But those are the pieces I'm talking about, the vital pieces. So we need to ensure that we have a resiliency around water supply, food supply, and housing and shelter, whatever you want to call it. And energy is part of that, a heated place to live. We live in
Mhm.
a very um, um, uh, anti-human climate for a
Yeah.
large part of our year. And so we need to make sure we have each of those pieces. And to understand, Canadians don't really understand. They turn on a tap, they don't know where the water comes from. That's the municipal order of government. In most cases in our country, that's the municipal order of government. And holding municipal government account that the water system doesn't exist, but that it's resilient. And so I would need to define that word, because people say, oh, yeah, we want everything to be resilient, but they don't have a clue what that word means. It breaks into three words, three concepts. Number one, hardening. So you want to make sure that your water supply system, we'll use it as the example, is protected, that it's got the ability to function, and that it doesn't break readily. So hardening. Number two, speed of repair. If it does break, you need to be able to have the components and all of the pieces on hand, plus the trained people to immediately return it to service. So hardening, speed of repair, and the last piece is redundancy. So you have to have more than one of them. You need to have everything you need duplicated or triplicated depending on what it is. So when we talk about water supply, food supply, shelter, and energy, we need them to be resilient with hardening, speed of repair, and redundancy. And so that is a role of government, not to do it, but to ensure that the private sector is doing it. All right. So a very small regulatory framework to guarantee national self-sufficiency through a regulatory framework that's minimum, but that says if you're going to be responsible for this, you have to have two of them. Okay. If
Yeah.
you're going to be responsible for this, we need to grow our food in Canada and support a private sector industry that thrives making food for Canadians while sharing with it with an international market, but always knowing that if suddenly the borders get closed all around us through war or whatever, a fake pandemic, we have self-sufficiency, that we don't need truckers driving to Mexico to pick up enough food so we don't starve within a week in our own country.
So I just want to touch base on the word regulatory, because I think that there's a little bit of uncertainty about it, and people don't even know about it. I think that was where I started my legal career, in the regulatory field on energy development in Alberta. So, and I like how you explained it. Is what I think people don't understand the role of the government and then the role of the private sector in these things. And the role of the government is to identify through regulatory processes how far, and emissions for the what would be too much emissions, or how where pipelines should go and flow. So there's checks and balances that are supposed to come through the regulatory framework of government. And then that's how the private sector is supposed to act according to these regulations that are put in place. Um, what I think we could talk about a little bit is where that's kind of failed, and then also where the public sector has jumped in to take on some of these roles that once were private, and as we see from people that are in Alberta know this very well, in Calgary, like a very prosperous city, they weren't able to use water, I think, for it was 2 months in the summer of last year. Like, how is this even acceptable in a city like Calgary, in a country like Canada, when you talked about redundancy, you talked about, all the ways that this is how it should be handled. So, if we could talk about those 2 things a little bit.
So to me, the regulatory framework has two roles. And
Yeah.
please add to them and subtract to them. This is remember, I wrote this paper to start discussion.
Yes.
Dave's ideas aren't gold. Dave's ideas are a start for discussion, but I only see regulatory framework and as the director of counterterrorism in this province, I had to rip deep down into a whole bunch of regulation. Two main concepts. Number one, a regulatory framework is there to create a fair and balanced playing field for private sector to engage.
Okay.
So to stop monopolies and to stop those things, the antitrust regulations that were brought into the US in the 1890s were to stop the mega corporations which blew all competition out of the water. So you couldn't have an open, free, and competitive market. Somebody dominated everything, then they dictated the terms to the government. So to create an open and fair playing field for all private sector companies and investment and
Mhm.
then to make sure that it stays that way. That's
Yeah.
what the regulations are for, is to make sure the playing field stays fair. And the open competition is not just encouraged, but demanded. So how do you create redundancy? Through competition. A whole
Mhm.
bunch of people all trying to provide the same service better and better and better to get you, the customers, business. And the second piece of it is to ensure worker safety. Okay, so within a reasonable set of terms and limits to ensure that workers aren't exploited. So, as we saw in the 1800s in the Industrial Revolution, the leadership of a new emerging industry didn't give a crap about whether or not you died on the shop floor. Like we were seeing 13-year-olds being employed doing extremely dangerous jobs because there was a whole bunch more 13-year-olds, so they just kill you off and put the new one in. So government has a role in the requirement to ensure workplace safety to a standard which Canadians agree to. Okay, and that's where the 256 shades of gray, you can overregulate or underregulate, but workplace safety and a fair and open playing field for all business. Those to
Mhm.
me is the only area for regulation and the only place for public sector involvement to ensure that all Canadians are treated fairly when competing in the workplace.
Great explanation.
So to me that's the regulatory framework. And anything that doesn't fit that definition should not be in any regulation. So people don't understand, a lot of folks that haven't been involved, at the top is a piece of legislation. So we legislate something. Underneath that, in most cases, there's a regulation that's then written. And in the regulation is the devil that starts the detail, because in the legislation, it sounds esoteric, it sounds wonderful, and politicians walk away. The minute they pass the legislation, they think they've done their job. The rhetoric got them reelected, it's great, it's fine, but then the regulation gets written. And then the regulation turns into practices, and the practices turn into standards. And as you go down that pipe, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and your bureaucracy gets bigger and bigger and bigger, because every time you write a word on a page, there has to be somebody to enforce it, or at least somebody to rewrite it in 3 years, or somebody to review it and have a discussion group around it and another working group. And so that this pyramid gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Those regulations, which are supposedly approved by a minister in most governments in Canada, but then it's all the deputy ministers and the civil service that sit underneath it. And it's their job to make sure they don't lose their job. So they write a regulation that clearly involves them doing more and more and more and more. And we've seen a 67% increase in the federal civil service while actually delivering less services to Canadians because they're busy ensuring their own jobs. And
Mhm.
I hate it when I was a civil servant, I hated when people talked about me like that. But you can't justify and 60 in less than 5 years, a 67% increase in the federal civil service while they've tripled the number of contractors that they're
Yeah.
contracting work out to. That's when you see that you've lost the beat, that it's not about workplace safety and it's not about creating a fair and open, balanced playing field for the private sector. And government, in my opinion, should never do any job that can be done by the private sector. It's not about better or worse. If you create the right balanced playing field, it will be done better by the private sector. Because when there's profit involved, people work and they want to thrive. They don't want to survive. The problem is when you do it in a government workplace with guaranteed salaries, guaranteed pensions, and a guaranteed future, you've created universal basic income for everybody that works in that public sector, and they'll do anything to ensure their job is never taken away, and it stops being about delivery to the customer. So when
Yeah.
we get into this whole discussion about the money following the service, we talk about education. We'll talk about that in the next session. But when the money follows the child, instead of the money following the teacher. Okay. We need to have this whole discussion about public versus private sector.
Yeah.
When we talk about daycare, government run daycare versus private sector daycare, we should just create a stable playing field where there's massive number. We know there's so many children because we've now created a society where both husband and wife, that it takes two incomes to sustain a family. So when child come into the equation, there's a requirement for daycare in many cases because one of the two doesn't want to stay at home for the first 5 years to get their children. So we're in the situation where we've said only government can run daycare. We're going to guarantee $25 a day, which means it you can't do it for that much.
Yeah.
Okay? We've created a situation where the government system will fail, but only the government system is allowed, and it'll fail over and over and over. So we need to create this regulatory framework. So we've
Well,
talked about.
and just before you jump
Yep.
into that, I want to say I think Canada is like just a perfect example too right now at how this doesn't work because in Canada we have had a lot of these government more controlled services. But I was actually thinking about this morning before we even had this conversation. I was literally thinking, what services have improved? And none. None in Canada that I can think of, yet we're spending more. So it's just like a perfect real life example. It's not about just spending more government money. That's not the answer, obviously. And
Correct.
I think we're at a time now in Canada, and this is why there's a lot of disconnect and people are looking for alternatives like independence, for example, because they see that it's the services are not there for them, even though they're investing into them. So
Let's
anyway,
use
I
a
just
really
wanted to,
simple example: the Canadian passport.
yeah,
The passport was working fine. The passport was recognized internationally as being a secure passport. It was respected. It worked great. And so we spent 3 years with a bunch of committees, a whole bunch of contracted advisors, a great discussion about changing the pictures in the passport, and then at huge expense reissued all the passports with these new funny little pictures. 3 years of an absolute boondoggle for a passport that was just fine.
meanwhile, it takes longer to get your passport.
And then completely collapsed the passport offices that were issuing the passports to citizens in this age of AI and high
Yeah,
tech, where it should have been super easy to get
yeah,
a new passport with the appropriate clearances in a faster time frame. And it went exactly the opposite. That's
yeah,
what happens when government delivers a service as opposed to a private sector that has to look for every penny.
yeah. No, perfect example. And I think I might have shared this is when I was redoing mine. A couple from Spain said that you could get it within an hour in Spain. And meanwhile, we were lined up at 6:30 in the morning with 200 people in front of us to be there before the doors opened at
I
8:30 or 9.
understand the need for security background checks, but we're not doing them because we're issuing these passports to terrorists that are coming into our country. So we're
Oops.
obviously not doing the security check side of it, but I can walk into a licensing bureau, a private sector
Yeah.
licensing bureau working on pay from the government of Alberta. I can walk in with my driver's license and walk out with my new driver's license 15 minutes later with a brand new picture on it.
Well, and that's something maybe to identify because I don't know if that's in Alberta. We have privatized driver's licenses, but my guess is, and I don't know for sure, but other provinces
Correct.
probably haven't.
And so to make that for all orders of government. So
Yeah.
when we talk about self-sufficiency for the essentials of life and the whole idea of minimum, I would like to see it less, but only 30% public sector, 70% private sector. That should be our first goal, is in a decade to rebalance the percentage of public and private sector, providing everything from self-sufficiency to everything else. So moving to the everything else, just so that we can carry this thought through, I write a strong, diverse, resilient private sector. Okay, a strong, diverse,
Hmm.
resilient private sector. So by strong, I mean that we encourage innovation, a strong private sector that is 70% or more of our economy. Okay, that's strong. 70% or more of our economy is in the private sector. That creates that middle class. That creates that ability to generate the wealth to have economic prosperity so you can raise a family and have property and to launch children into the world in an appropriate manner. And so when I say diverse, the second word is diverse. I want to talk about resource industries. Let's go back to 1967. Canada was the hewers of wood, the haulers of ore, and the producers of energy. We were known worldwide as this burly guy in a lumberjack shirt, chopping down trees and digging the stones out of the earth. And wasn't that wonderful? We were really proud, but everybody said, oh, we got to be more. We got to be more. Well, instead of being more in the private sector, we went into doing more in social services, not in the hewers of wood, the haulers of ore. And we didn't, that was dirty handwork. We set it aside and went into social services as,
Hmm.
and we watched the public sector take off, right? So when I say diverse, I want to talk about, again, being the resource industries. And suddenly it's fashionable again now that there's critical minerals that we need for EVs. But the resource sector, we need to really double down. There's huge, good paying, solid jobs for a whole career because you don't spend your whole life chopping a tree down. One of my uncles started off literally with a two-bladed axe in the 1920s chopping trees in BC and ended up being the president of McMill and Bloedel Pulp and Paper. All right. So you can work your way through a whole career in the forestry sector, in the mining sector, in the starting from the bottom and working your way up, going getting more education. We'll talk next session about continuous lifelong learning. You can, but resource industries, we need to really double down. Canada is the world's treasure trove for the resource industries. Value-added industries. Value-added industry is taking that basic resource and turning it into the next step. Not maybe perhaps all the way to the end state. Not you're not going to take the ore out of the ground and end up with a computer at the end of it. But there's so many steps to get to that computer. We need to be doing the value-added so we make more money into Canada off of those resources by refining the materials and turning them into stage 1, stage 2, or even stage 3 of that resource before we ship it to someone else to turn it into stage 16. Okay? So value-added industry, manufacturing. Manufacturing has basically been forced out of our country by a group of people who thought they could get cheap labor in Mexico first and then in China. And so we built an economy that went for cheapest, not necessarily best, but drove everything through the price of the worker. And so there comes a point in time where we need to have an open discussion because if you're going to have free market economy, but you also then have to make sure that when you do that with allies and partners, not with enemies. So if you are going to resource out your labor for everything you do in manufacturing, you also got to realize that when people don't like you, they will shut your country down in a heartbeat. We see it every day with China. We see them absolutely destroying our industry so they can get a monopoly and playing us against each other. Right now, the whole canola fight between Australia, the United States, and Canada is China playing us like idiots, running around in a circle. You never build an industry whose market is based on selling to an enemy. And so we need to go all the way back to national security. Remember how all 6 national interests link. When you are looking at your national security, don't build partnerships with enemies in economic prosperity and growth. They will destroy your country. They want to destroy your country. So you have to do all these linkages. You have to think these things through. So manufacturing, we need to onboard manufacturing again. And the same people that made a fortune as private sector consultants to the government, encouraging us to offshore our manufacturing, are now making a fortune recommending to the government that they onshore our manufacturing. Consultants are there to make money for themselves, not for the citizens of Canada. Let's have a step back and look at manufacturing in Canada and talk about what it makes sense to manufacture in Canada and what makes sense to have our partners and allies do with us and for us while we trade something else to them that we can do better than they can. And then finally, at the bottom of that list, I've got service industries, because service industries has become the predominant 50% of the Canadian economy now seems to be based on service industries for Canadians to feel better about themselves, right? And to have all these wonderful things. But somebody's got to earn the money to pay for the services, right? And the private sector is there for people through the resource industries, the value industries, the manufacturing industries, and any others that I forgot. I'm not an expert on this. Someone like Perrin Beatty is way better at this than I am. The head of the Chamber of Commerce of Canada up until very recently, who understood the mosaic of small business and big business in our country and the relationship between 55% small business, 45%. Maybe, I don't know what the right balance is, but it's got to be out there where all the small businesses contribute and the big businesses that make huge money that contribute so much to the labor market for all Canadian citizens. When I did counterterrorism, I always had this tube chart and I divided the economy up into tubes. And everybody look at one of those tubes and you say the energy industry, the transportation industry, but what they always forgot, and halfway through the presentation, they say, stop, you're missing the point. Those are citizens. Every one of those tubes is full of citizens. This isn't about some rich corporate CEO. This is about all the Canadians who work every day, whether it's on the plant floor or pulling the ore out of the ground. Those are citizens. And what we're trying to do is protect the citizens and to make sure that that industry is vibrant, resilient, that it's got, hardening, speed of repair, and redundancy. So those citizens will always have a job or can be transited to a new job if that tube collapses, right? So the whole idea is we're doing this so that citizens can have the ability to earn a good living, have private property, and provide for themselves and their families. They're in all these economic tubes, whether the resource, value-added, manufacturing, or service.
It's such a great reminder too, because I remember there was one of the NDP, maybe it was Jagmeet Singh even, he came with like a big scary looking an amount of papers to question the CEO of Loblaws, maybe it was. And the way he was talking to, and obviously it's not like I'm here to defend this man, but I was just thinking, for an NDP leader who's meant to be for the working class and the middle class, all I kept thinking is, how many people does that CEO employ, and whether this is the best strategy to be helping the workforce for Canadians. It was just such a theatrical presentation, like I said, with this bit thing. And I was
Two
just like,
pieces
how
of
many
regulation.
people did you employ?
Exactly. You want a fair environment for private sector to compete, and you want workplace safety. If it's not those two, get out of the room. And if
Yeah.
you're trying to destroy one of the three, chains for I want 10. I don't want you attacking one of them. I want you creating 10,
Yeah,
for an open
exactly.
and fair framework, and then get the hell out of the way. I want
Yeah.
more competition, not less. And when it all boiled down, Loblaws was making like a 3.2% profit in the year. Well, isn't private sector supposed to make a profit? And isn't they then hopefully returning that as investment to expand their customer base and to improve the service delivery? And yes, part of a thriving economy means some people do get rich, but so does every cashier, so does
Yeah.
every stock boy, so does they can actually support their family through, as long as you've done your only job, which is a fair and open marketplace and workplace safety.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, I totally agree with you. When I saw him doing that, I thought to myself, who in his family is working in the competition? And it came out his brother was. He was working for a Metro or one of the other
Yeah.
food chains. And
Yeah.
so this whole fair and equitable platform is spun when a politician chooses winners over losers.
Yeah.
Right? Leave
Yeah.
the private sector to sort itself out. And it's just like the discussion we're having south of the border right now. Stop trying to fix the president of the United States. The president of the United States is looking after the United States. I want a prime minister that is focused on fixing Canada by creating a workplace for the private sector in Canada where we can openly compete anywhere in the world on the world stage in a fair and equitable manner by encouraging minimum regulation with maximum output and more jobs for Canadians. Stop talking about tariffing our own industry in order to reduce consumption of our industry. A
Understood.
ridiculous concept, right? Your only job is an open and fair marketplace in
Yeah.
Canada and workplace safety, in my
And yeah, I think it's very well stated. And instead of stating that, what we hear people say is cutting red tape. And honestly, I didn't know what that meant until I opened two businesses. And then I was like, oh my gosh, this is an actual nightmare. Why would anyone open a business?
Yep.
I had a tiny little cafe. I think it was less than 800 square feet. No, we just had electric stoves. No, big oil facility and hood fan, which can require a little bit more issues. And I was getting held up so long by the city of Edmonton, and then so many stories on that. But all I'm going to say is I had to go in there, and I had already hired people to work at the cafe, but I was being held up by the city on a development permit that was already stamped by an engineer and an interior designer. And the city just had to check mark its boxes because it didn't add any value. And then I learned what it meant to be cutting of red tape. There's so many hoops and hurdles that businesses have to go through for I don't see the value added, to be perfectly honest, and you have to pay for all these hoops and hurdles. And then I was like, oh, that's what cutting red tape means. And we hear it that way rather than taking away from that, rather than what you said is what the goal should be.
Yep. And
And I
so
think
I
that's
take you
probably
back to the whole
intentional.
idea that, the legislation turns into regulation and then it
Yeah.
turns into 10,000 civil service jobs to build all of the pieces of the administration to make sure you can't open your business, right?
Yeah.
Instead of what's the fastest way to get you onto the
Yeah.
marketplace with fair competition, but while ensuring workplace safety. And so it's always the push me, pull me. And we've had the discussion before about the 256 shades of gray. And somewhere in the middle is reality. And you want to push it a little more to the white than a little less to the black. But there comes a point in time where if you've gone too far, then the workers or the customers become more at risk. Or over here, where the workplace and the customers aren't at any risk because you can't open. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's finding that balance. Like I used to do audits with the federal government on emergency management out there in big workplaces. And so the transportation of dangerous goods jumps to mind. Rail lines going through towns, the transport of anhydrous ammonia through small communities on trucks. And
Sounds a bit more dangerous than an electric stove making soup.
absolutely. But what I found was the government basically was doing none of it.
Nothing.
They were doing none of the supervision of all of these things, and yet they had a staff of hundreds who were totally pissed off because they weren't allowed to do any of it.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so we built this huge bureaucracy, and they had all these forms and paperwork, but they never actually went out and put their boots on the ground and walked around and looked at the rail yards and looked at the trucking situation. And now we see the results of that in things like massive immigrants now in our trucking sector with no licensing, with no and no safety standards being applied, causing mayhem on our roads. So again, that 256 shades of gray, there, you have to push it back and forth.
Yeah.
But when your bureaucracy is building and you're not getting any of it delivered, you have the worst of both worlds. And that's what happens, in my opinion, the more and more you push public sector over private sector,
Yeah.
but with public sector not doing its two regulatory functions.
Yeah.
And
No.
only those two, not
Yes.
delivering services.
Please, let's get back to some of that sanity.
So just the last bullet. Okay.
Yes.
So we've talked about, the ability to earn a good living, the national self-sufficiency for the essentials of life, a strong and diverse, resilient private sector economy. The last one now is where we've talked about dynamic prosperity. Let's talk about growth. So growth can happen naturally when people innovate and come up with good ideas. But one of the potential things for government to invest in, and it'll fall down a little bit more in a discussion when we get to societal well-being and our educational system, government has a role to some degree in research and development. Now, those are two words that people always just go R&D, but they're
Yeah.
two separate words for a reason. Research is where it takes a ton of money to perhaps produce nothing, because research is bleeding edge. It's where you think about the wildest ideas and you spitball them against the wall, and you get a whole bunch of really smart people in the room. You run a task force on it, normally in the private sector, and you think of all the different things you could make money off if only you could, but it costs a fortune to walk those to the ground. And then development is you've actually got one of them that fell off of that tree of 50, and one of them goes, wow, holy shit. I wonder if we could make a cell phone that somebody could hold in their hand and they could actually receive their mail here instead of at home on their computer. And that's then when you get into the D, which is the development. So on the R side, you 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 sometimes need the citizens' support, i.e., dollars, to play with crazy ideas, but only ones that fit. Remember, I take you always back to the 25-year vision. If that crazy idea doesn't fit somehow into the 25-year vision for your country, either you got the vision wrong, which is possible, or that's for some other country to do. Okay? It doesn't fit in Canada's economic prosperity and growth model for our 25-year vision. It's a really great idea. Let's find a partner that might want to do that while we help them with something else. That's where alliances and partnerships truly fit, and not China to teach them how to intercept our missiles. Let's work with the United States, who's going to intercept China's missiles, okay? But the R part is really costly and frequently leads nowhere. I watched my son try and do two startups in the technology sector, and basically got wiped out after 2 years, two times in a row, and had to go back and do more traditional jobs for a while to make enough money to try innovation one more time, right? But he's still not beaten down. He's still trying to do the R side all on his own. But the D side is where private sector thrives, okay? And so with a little encouragement, with the government defining a 25-year vision saying, this is the type of industry we really believe in our country, and that we are building a good regulatory framework to encourage more of in our country, i.e., not a tax haven, but a place where they can compete evenly on the world stage, that's where the D can take off. And so you take that really good idea and you get a whole bunch of companies all trying to take it to the next step. And it's like the old beta versus the VCR whole discussion, right? And which one won? Well, the one that was cheapest ultimately, because one had way better quality and was a beautiful machine, but nobody would buy it because the other one was made cheaper. And then we had 20 companies making VCRs, all, you know, the D part takes
I
care of
didn't
itself,
know
but you
I
gotta
didn't know
play
that
with
was
the
the
R.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that was the story of the VCR versus the
Yeah,
Beta.
Beta
Beta?
lost because it was too expensive. It was a way better quality and capability for recording and everything else, but it costs double what a standard VCR would cost, so
Yeah,
they lost the marketplace.
yeah,
And Sony, who was pushing the Betamax, all of a sudden went, piss on it, we'll go with them. And they started building VCRs like crazy, and we all had them in our homes later because the D side, the market played out, right? We let
yeah,
the market do its own thing. Take the government out of it and let the citizens decide. But think of all the great jobs all those people had in all of those companies. So
yeah,
sometimes you need a little government injection in the R piece. And after that, let it go. But don't pick winners and losers.
yeah.
Let the market.
But have a vision, have a reason for these. That
Why
makes
are
sense
we
too.
investing this little
Yeah,
bit of our money? Where are we
yeah,
going as a country? Does
yeah,
that fit the future 25-year vision? And that 25-year vision gets rebuilt every 5 years with a citizen involved, a group of experts that come together and reissue it to the public, and the public gets to vote on it, and all their feedback goes into the next 5-year revision, right?
yeah,
This is a never ending 20, you move it forward in 5-year steps, right? And all you're electing then is which political party will deliver the 25-year vision the best, in your opinion.
yeah. No, super interesting and things again we just don't talk about in every day, which is so important. Obviously, I don't even know how we're having political discussions without this. It's just reactive, divisive, hateful, and shameful at this point, the
We
conversation.
would
So,
talk about wedge issues for hours,
yeah,
but we won't talk about what's the what should Canadians be looking forward to in their employment for the next 25 years in Canada? What are the
yeah,
great, and no, don't pick me some bleeding edge technology that may or may not fail. What are the basis things that we can build up? And if that bleeding edge technology comes true, then at the appropriate time in 15 years, we'll carry on because we built the foundation. But you don't just leap in to build a battery plant, two of which have failed completely because we decided we were going to take a generational leap
yeah.
in something that was A, based on a lie, and B, a false premise to begin with.
Well, and it's something I wanted to bring or talk about a little bit more that you started with, and maybe this is a good place to finish unless there's something more. But right at the start of the conversation, you said you developed this to force the conversation with elected officials. And I wanted to go back to that because I think that's something Canadians have to own and understand that that's part of their civic responsibility. I used the term before, you can demand things of your government because it's your government to demand. But I like that you said force the conversation too, but not just about these divisive, silly wedge issues that we keep getting distracted by. About these very important conversations about 25-year vision. Where is job security for me? Where is the housing market for my child? So forcing these very important conversations because, and it's unfortunate our elected officials aren't doing it, but there's also a responsibility and an obligation on us to force that conversation. So I just
Correct.
wanted to go back to that and get some more comments from you on how important that is.
Well, I always go back in every one of our discussions. I always go back to the idea that the reason I wrote the paper was to give the words, to give the verbiage and a possible methodology for re-engaging with our political class, which I believe was out of touch with the citizens of our country. And I wrote that right into the paper. And so the whole idea of If you want to talk about unity, here's all the words. If you want to talk about national security, here's all the words. You want to talk about economic prosperity? We just gave you a whole bunch of words. Demand, they say, so how do you see industry in, let's use Alberta? What does the industry in Alberta look like in 25 years? And don't just say oil and gas. Tell me what you really think Alberta could be in 25 years. What are all the different types of industry we could have in this province? Let's talk about the difference between Alberta and Ontario. Let's talk about the difference between BC and Alberta. We don't have an ocean, so ports and port handling facilities and all the rest of that stuff doesn't fit into an Alberta jobs in Alberta, right? So let's have these real deep discussions, because when we talk about the types of industries, we didn't talk about the transportation sector. We didn't talk about all the other possible, high tech and all the rest of it. But we did. That's where you get value added industry and all the rest of it. The whole idea is, here's some words, Canadians. There's 6 national interests that define a country. Pick the one that you're most interested, or pick all 6. Now, when you talk to your politicians, here's the verbiage to use. And I don't want to talk about transgender issues. I want to talk about unity. So here's all the pieces that I think that make up the unity in our country: respect, compassion, equality, blah, blah, blah. So how are you, as my elected official, going to achieve unity and stop breaking us into smaller and smaller groups to pit us against each other? I want your story on how you're going to bring us all together, and what you think is most important, and then I'll decide if I'm going to give you my vote. I want to talk to you about national security, and I don't want to talk about the Canadian Armed Forces. I want to talk about mass immigration and all the elements that make it up. I don't want, so all the words are in the paper. And now it helps empower you to have a meaningful discussion at the municipal order of government, provincial and federal order of government, and understand what each of them do for you, and have the right discussion with the right person.
So, question, because I think that this is where lots of Canadians are right now, is what if our elected officials don't have any answers or don't know anything about
Then
this issue?
challenge them to either go learn it, or you're taking your vote somewhere else, and take your friends and tell your friends, this is the answer I got from this individual. We have social media. You can say, I tried to have a meaningful discussion. This was the answers I was given. Maybe one of you can do better with this individual, or maybe we can find a better person to represent us, right? And
Yeah.
then finding that person to run for office or to become involved in a meaningful way, or to become the CA of an area, to find that person, right? There's so many ways of it's the sun has gone off your book, but it's still right there. How to become engaged. Reconnect to Canada is how to re-engage as a citizen with your country. So I've I wrote the paper to try and give tools and words for people to find out whether their politicians were even talking the same language as them. If they're not, then you need to reconnect and re-engage in the political system and find your role. Is it writing letters to your politicians? Is it making phone calls? Is it showing up at council meetings? Is it actually marching in the streets? Is it, you choose each individual citizen has to choose their own path. But if you don't, if you aren't involved, if you don't care about the country, it will be a country where you survive, you never thrive.
Yeah. And obviously, I totally agree with that. And I think what I would just add is, by engaging in these conversations, I think I'm all about trying to elevate the conversation. So I think we're elevating the conversation with our elected officials. It's not just the division and the regular rhetoric. Maybe it gets them thinking onto a 25-year vision plan. Maybe they'll bring that to the party. That's being very optimistic. Maybe it's going to encourage that person to run or talk to other people about, I can't believe this terrible answer I got from my elected official. This is not the level that should be in charge of our city, and I don't even know like what billions and millions their budget is. Same provincially. Like, we have to think about that. we have billion-dollar budgets, and it's being run by somebody that can't answer some of these very basic questions. We have to rethink that strategy too. And I think in the last session or the one before, we talked about, ideal candidates being, younger and vibrant. So anyway,
That
that's
whole
one thing I
discussion
just
about
wanted
what's
to.
the best age. A politician, in my opinion, sort of that 35 to 55. You've got enough knowledge, you've got real experience, you're a meaningful contributor. Where someone like me who's 71, we've seen what happens when you get people over the age of 70 running countries. It's not pretty. So let's not do that. Let's get the people who have enough knowledge and experience, but who can actually sustain it in an ethical, their bodies won't let them down. They're physically fit. They're intellectually fit. And they have the courage to apply them. Let's get those people out there.
It's so funny that because when you said that too, I did think about it, and same now is I would have suggested an older age would be ideal, but
Those are your
that's super
advisors.
interesting to hear. Yeah.
That's your advisors.
Yeah,
You
I
don't
could
kick
I
the
could
old
see that.
politicians and the old industry experts
Yeah,
to the curb. You use them the way we used to use them, as behind the scenes, giving
yeah,
advice, talking about things. When you suddenly you get this new bright idea and you're 45 years old and you forgot what happened in 1989, that was tried before and didn't turn out so well.
yeah,
And here's why. So maybe your idea is still good, but you can't do it that way. That's
yeah,
where that one ended up. But I'm telling you, e- people of my age can't sustain. I can't go on the road campaigning for 15 weeks and then be effective to run a government. My body is 71 years old. When I was 45 commanding a battalion, I could run all day and all night. I could work on 2 hours sleep a night and did frequently on the inter-German border. I'm 71. I go to bed at 10 o'clock and I get up at 6. And if I don't get my 8 hours sleep, I'm useless. I want politicians that can go all day, all night and lead my country to thrive.
Well, and one of the reasons too is there had been a few comments on our discussions that you should be leading the whole country. So I was like, yes, so much knowledge, but at the same time, I totally get it. And being an advisor like that, instead, when I see a lot of is a lot of very young children in the government, and they're very close to the elected officials. And I'm like, I'm not really sure if a university,
Need
d-
enough
high school
education,
aged.
but experience in life. You need that. You need to go out there and get knocked down and climb yourself back up.
Yeah.
You know, when I was a captain operations officer in the middle of the Cold War, sitting on the inter-German border, running all the supply transport maintenance for the Canadian Brigade of 6,000, the number of times I woke up in the morning and went, shit, I didn't do that very well yesterday. Better do it better today, or I'm going to get frickin' fired. You know, you learn tough lessons, and you're covered in mud and you're short on sleep, but you got to figure it out. You do, right? You do. But until you've got that background of getting up and standing up again and walking straight into the blender and coming out of it alive, that's the type of person you need in politics to lead a country. You don't
Yeah.
want a newbie whose first time they get hit in the teeth and fall on the ground, they go, "Oh, I can't get up." I don't want to hear that. Yeah, I'd like you to lead my country, right?
Yeah. Get up and fight. Yeah, no, great discussion again as always. So thank you for that. Very lots of interesting themes that came out. Like I said, middle class, and I think most people, obviously the majority, fit into that. So we have to recognize that and how that affects
We
us.
want that to
Um,
be the majority in
yeah,
25 years still in this country. We don't want an elite and serfs.
yeah, yeah. That's pretty common sense. A lot of these discussions, I go back to that, sounds very reasonable and common sense. So thank you again for this discussion. And we have one more, so I'll be looking forward to that one.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it as well. Thank you, Eva.